Hello, my name is Drew, and this is my presentation. So I decided to focus on US-Iran relations and look at how that relationship affects stability in the Middle East. Since we're talking about global political turbulence, I wanted to try to find a source of a lot of that turbulence. And so in my paper, I covered a couple of those sources, namely the Arab Spring, which was started in late 2010, early 2011, that swept across the Middle East, as well as the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so, while both of these events have major implications for the region, I wanted to look at a relationship between the U.S. and one of the actors in the Middle East to find out more about where a lot of this turbulence comes from. So, the U.S. and Iran have never really had a great relationship, but this relationship has really deteriorated ever since the Trump administration has come in. As I noted in my policy paper, one of the biggest foreign policy blunders of the Trump administration was withdrawing from the JCPOA, or the Iran deal. The US also reimposed sanctions on Iran, which has been really devastating for the economy. The Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in order to hurt Iran economically, in the hopes that they would not be able to spread their influence across the Middle East. And it's worked, but it's had a really negative effect on Iran economically, socially, politically. We've seen a ton of protests over the last 2 years. Iranians want economic reform to help relieve some of the stress that the sanctions have provided. But as I mentioned in my paper, as the Arab Spring showed, one of the dangerous things about this internal instability within Iran is there's a big threat for a contagion effect to spread. We've seen a lot of protests and deadly movements in Iraq recently. And so, with all this turbulence going on in the Middle East, it's really not unthinkable that we see another wave of a Arab Spring like movement sweep across the region. So, the Arab Spring hit the Middle East in late 2010, and we still see a lot of fallout from that. Libya, Yemen, and Syria are still fighting civil wars as a result, and both the US and Iran are extremely active in Yemen and Syria. As far as the war in Yemen is concerned, Iran has backed the Houthi rebels, which took over the Hadi government. Uh, the Houthi rebels captured Sana'a, the capital, in 2014 and 2015. And they've been fighting the Hadi forces, which are backed by the US, Saudi Arabia, and UAE primarily. And of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran are two big rivals in the Middle East. And so this is just one example of where they've been fighting on the ground. Another example of turbulence in the region was the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and this inadvertently ignited the Sunni Shia civil war in Iraq, and it also really destabilized the region. And so back to the JCPOA, the intent was to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And as you can see, these are some of the percentages of uranium enrichment levels. Before the JCPOA was signed, Iran was enriching uranium at about 20%, but the JCPOA restricted that to 3.67%, which is around the level needed for nuclear reactors. Now, 90% enrichment levels is needed for nuclear weapons, but the time it takes to go from 20% to 90% is very small, only a couple weeks or a couple months. But with the JCPOA intact, it would have kept Iran from obtaining these levels. It would have taken them 10 or 15 years at the very least. So when the US left the JCPOA and re-implemented sanctions on Iran, it was devastating for the economy, as I mentioned. I get into this a little bit more in my policy paper, but a couple of quick highlights. Both the IMF and World Bank estimate Iran's economy will shrink. It was in between 8.5 and 9.5%, which is, of course, a lot. Since the sanctions were re-implemented, inflation has been a huge problem. As you can see, in the last 2 years, it's risen by about 35.7%. And for things like food and fuel, It's reached 63.5%. And this is the source for a lot of these protests and movements we've been seeing in Iran over the last couple of years. The Iranians wanting economic reform. And so the Trump administration's policy towards Iran has been this maximum pressure. The U.S. wants to hurt Iran economically so they can't spread their influence throughout the region. At the same time, the U.S. has deployed several thousand, tens of thousands of troops to the Middle East and really just re-escalated U.S.-Iran relations. Over the summer, a U.S. drone was shot down over the Strait of Hormuz. Both sides have argued about if the drone was actually over Iranian territory or not. But the Trump administration authorized an airstrike on Iran following the attack, but thankfully it was called off. And so this maximum pressure campaign aimed at hurting Iran has been really devastating and threatens regional stability in the area. And so these were the policy recommendations that I came up for. This is what I would advise the Trump administration to do on Iran. I listed three pretty simple, pretty straightforward policy recommendations that the Trump administration could use. And I think if implemented, they could really repair the U.S.-Iran relationship and introduce regional stability to the Middle East. So the first recommendation is to re-enter the JCPOA and lift all sanctions on Iran. A lot of policy experts and analysts believe that the Trump administration left the JCPOA purely based on a partisan move to undermine the Obama administration. But whatever the reason was, it was a huge blunder. It's created much more turbulence in the region, and it's really benefited nobody. Even if the U.S. and Iran are competing for influence in the region, intentionally damaging the Iranian economy is a dangerous move. Instead, the U.S. should focus on repairing relationships with Iran. My second recommendation was to limit the U.S. military involvement in the Middle East. I don't really have much of a problem with the U.S. maintaining a military presence all over the world, but the military engagement is what's really worrisome. In Yemen, for example, the U.S. and Iran are competing for power, and it's directly led to the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And my final policy recommendation was to pressure Israel to avoid conflict with Iran. Both countries have been going at it militarily, engaging in armed conflict across the region. This has been evidenced in Syria, as Israel has targeted the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And Iran has also targeted Israel using a lot of their proxy forces. So this Iran-Israel rivalry, it's really dangerous for the Middle East. It really has the potential to lead to a war between the two countries. So again, I think the Trump administration should do whatever they can to de-escalate the conflict and try to provide some stability to the region. And so that's really how I feel about the situation. I think the U.S. should opt for a de-escalation with Iran, not try to prod and poke Iran. That's pretty damaging for U.S. interests in the region. And so to conclude, and I can see I've gone over my time, so I apologize for that, but the Trump administration has taken this hardline approach with Iran, and it really hasn't worked out. Iran is not North Korea, and this tactic of trying to bully Iran into what the Trump administration wants them to do won't work out well. Iran has a powerful military, and I highlighted their capabilities in my policy paper a little bit more. And their economy isn't great, but it's relatively strong. It's definitely stronger than North Korea. And these ideas of the U.S. going to war with Iran, they're just absolutely ridiculous. That's not a fight that the U.S. wants, not a fight the U.S. can win. It serves no purpose. And so that's the conclusion of my paper. Again, I think the theme is de-escalation. There's really no need for the U.S. to try to start a fight with Iran. I would hope that the Trump administration would follow these recommendations or similar ones. But for the U.S.-Iran relationship to be repaired, we're probably going to have to wait for the next presidential administration. And so that concludes my presentation and the summary of my paper. I hope that it was informative. And again, I apologize for going over the time, but thank you for listening.